Welcome back to the Conscious Consultant Hour, Awakening Humanity. My guest this hour is Donald Altman, and we're talking all about mindfulness and what he deems emotional clutter in his new book, Clearing Emotional Clutter. So, Donald, I'm just curious about something, see, because my wife always gets on my case. Like, I'm a hoarder. I keep stuff all the time. My wife is the exact opposite. She's always throwing stuff out. So I'm curious, do you find in your practice that when people who have a lot of emotional clutter, does their physical environment tend to be cluttered, or is there not really a correlation between the two?
Yeah, no, not necessarily. It's sometimes a separate. It's interesting, but sometimes I just have found it to be separate.
Okay.
I think people can be very organized, but they still don't recognize all the emotional clutter going through their head.
Okay, so just because somebody has a very clean place and not much stuff and everything's in the perfect place doesn't mean that that there's not some clutter going on internally.
Right.
Okay. So when we talk about emotional clutter, I think people probably don't take it too seriously because it doesn't sound like a big deal. Oh, well, it's just some clutter. I can just sweep it under the rug, or, I can just clean it up whenever I want. But it's a little bit more serious than that, isn't that?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And this idea of sweeping it under the rug is exactly the antithesis of what mindfulness is about, which means that we directly confront what is before us, and our, it's kind of like being in the what is as opposed to the what if. Mm-hmm. So we are trying to be present with everything. And I heard a wonderful quote from, and I'm going to paraphrase this, from Pema Chodron, who's a lady,
I love her work.
Nun, and she wrote or said something to the effect of, you might be the most depressed person in the world, the most miserable person in the world, the most addicted person in the world, but that's the best place to start. And so you start where you are, and you start by noticing what you can notice. And, we tie knots, and I use that as kind of a metaphor. Right. If you're stuck in traffic and you yell at somebody out the window, I mean, you're endangering maybe yourself and that other person with, road rage, and yet, how many of us really look back at where did that start? Oh, how did that not first get tied? Where did that anger start? Where did my impatience start? Where did my frustration with others start? And these little things that you might not think are big end up pushing away those that we love, affecting our relationships, and affecting our ability to be really effective in the world. And so you might think they're just brief manifestations of some emotion, but they really have a big effect on us. And internally, the effect is that the negative cortisol and adrenaline hit that we get from being negatively aroused really affects our immune system. So you're also talking about being more vulnerable to illness. You even when you're under a stress state. Even something called NK cells, or natural killer cells that are part of your immune system, are destroyed by cortisol, and those fight viruses and even some kinds of tumors. So there's a direct link with how the peace within your mind and the wellness in your body.
Right. So it actually has physical manifestations. So how does somebody start off even recognizing that they have emotional clutter, or should we just take it for granted like we all have it?
Well, first of all, we do all have it, and our minds can be just very, very reactive, and they're very fast. Right. Being reactive, and sometimes I call it mind whispers. Our thoughts are so fast we don't even know. Yeah, we're acting like a robot in response to these very subtle mind whispers or subtle mind commands that are conditioned thoughts. So one way that you can start to break free of that is to do what I call inner Facebooking. And I have a whole chapter about that, and that I think will wake people up to let them see, wow, this is what's going on in my mind.
So tell me more about that. Tell me more about this inner Facebooking, because we're big Facebook people here on the radio station.
Oh, cool. Okay. Well, I don't know if you knew that. Some research, it was research from Facebook themselves that came out about a month ago, and they said that the average Facebook user is on Facebook about 51 minutes a day, and that's about 1/16 of our waking time. So that's a lot of time, and the thing is to notice how, notice that Facebook can affect our emotions, right, by the posts that other people put up and so forth. But in the same way, so that's kind of a metaphor for how can we notice the inner Facebook posts that we're putting up in our minds. A Facebook post, a mental Facebook post that says, I'm not really as good as that other person, or I'm inadequate, or gosh, I wish I had that other job or that other promotion. Why didn't I get that? All these things are rattling around, and these are like Facebook posts, and you're putting up thousands of them every day. And how many of those are really telling you something about your strengths, or how many are negatively affecting you and impacting you? We know that that verbal abuse. This is really fascinating. We've been learning a lot about science and the brain. We learned that verbal abuse, and even from parents or parental and peer, so you with your friends or we were at school, that peer verbal abuse can actually be as bad as physical or sexual abuse.
Right.
So here we are talking about internal, our own abuse of ourselves, and yet we let it continue. Right.
Right.
And and so this practice of starting to notice your inner Facebook posts and start to just notice it with a sense of curiosity, not to blame ourselves. There's another negative thing we can say, right? Oh gosh, look at all these bad thoughts. I suck, right? Or you can actually start to distance from those thoughts and just get curious about them, and just to notice, wow, look at that thought. Look at that negative thought. Oh, look at that interesting thought. Isn't that amazing? And just have a sense of wonder about them. I had a gentleman I worked with, great story about he learned to distance from his thoughts. He would have anxiety attacks every day. I mean, it was incapacitating him. His father had died of a heart attack at a very young age, Sam. And so what he did was he had actually learned to hyper-focus on his body and bodily sensations. So if his palms, he noticed they were a little, clammy or a little wet, he'd have a catastrophizing thought, oh my God, this is the beginning of that heart attack. And then he would escalate up with all these thoughts until he would have an anxiety attack. Well, as I worked with him, and one of the great things about mindfulness is it does get you into the body, and I call the body kind of an early warning system for knowing what's happening. And so he started to notice the body, and I got him into the body and kind of out of his head, right? And he noticed the body had all of these hundreds, thousands of little sensations every day, and that the thoughts were different from what was happening in the body. They were not the same. Right? And so eventually he would hear these catastrophizing thoughts, and he would just say to that thought, he'd say, oh, hello again, old friend. He didn't fight. He didn't resist that thought. And we put a lot, think about how much energy you put into resisting your thoughts.
Ooh.
Right?
Never thought
That's
about
suffering.
That.
That is suffering. And so, I think one of the key ideas in this book is to how do we release ourselves from the suffering of emotional clutter.
Right.
And so once you don't have to grab onto that thought, or you don't identify, and that's not necessarily a fact, right? Or that's not necessarily who I am. Gives you a sense of relief, a sense of liberation, where then you can be, you can be more present with what's happening right here in front of you, instead of being stuck grabbing onto all those thoughts. So that's how I think inner Facebooking can be a very powerful practice.
And I guess, meditation ends up being sort of like practicing for not holding on to it. I know a lot of people feel like meditation's supposed to be about not thinking, but really it's not. It's about not holding on to your thoughts. So if you can
That's how I view it. Is that it's not about, quote, emptying the mind and having no thoughts, but about recognizing what's in the mind and not attaching or, not clinging to it.
Right. And what role? I'm a big believer in community. I was just on the prior radio show with Aurea and being community radio. We were talking, one of the aspects of sort of a spiritual path is community and how important community is with us. How important is community when you're working on your emotional clutter?
I think it's very important, and it's very important to start to recognize the positive resources in your life, and people who you can be a benefactor to, and also people who maybe are your benefactor, and learning how to draw on those resources and to let them in. Right. This whole we live under this illusion we're a very independent oriented culture, individualistic. Yeah. And so we sometimes have the false belief that I'm doing it all myself, and in truth, everything's interconnected. And so how can we start to open up and develop friendship and develop what I call that purposeful partnership? I think it's really critical.
But how does that help with the clearing of emotional clutter? I mean, I think we all get it. I mean, I'm a big proponent of community. Community is so important in my life. But then how do we apply, okay, now I've got like-minded people around me and I've got some good people who support me. How do I apply that to clearing my emotional clutter? Well,
because it helps you connect with your gift. And I think that what's important is to start to really, and I talk about this here, is helping people identify what is my gift, what do I have to offer, right? Where's my passion? And once you identify your gift, that focuses you, that gives you a meaning, and that clears away a lot of the negative clutter because you are moving towards something, and you're being more intentional in your life. Right. So I think that's a good question you raised, because I think that's using and recognize your own gift. Like there's a guy who I interviewed, a fascinating story. A lot of people think their gift has to be some big, huge, giant thing, and often it's what we already have to offer. Right. Like this guy he was a barber, and his daughter had an ear problem, and they brought her to a clinic, and they had to do an operation. He couldn't afford it, but they donated it to him, and he was very touched by that. And he said, help my daughter. What can I do for you? I said, I'd like to help somehow, but all I am is a barber. I cut people's hair. And they said, well, why don't you cut people's hair for people who are in need, who maybe are going on a job interview and want to look good. And so he started doing that, and he was doing I don't know, several thousands of haircuts, and actually talked to some of the people whose hair he cut, people who may be living in, homeless shelters and so forth. Yeah. But getting that haircut meant a tremendous amount to those people. And so here he shared something that he already had, his gift, and really changed lives for those folks. So sometimes we don't have to look too far to find that gift. Yeah. Beautiful. Yeah, I love that story. I even saw something like that on Facebook. Oh, really? Okay.
Okay, it's time for us to take Believe It or Not.
And you know what? I want to say I think technology is great, and we need to know how to help us get inspired by it. Right. And I think that
right. It's a tool like any other, and it's just learning how to use it the right way.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Okay. Believe it or not, it's time for us to take our last commercial break of the show. So when we come back, I want to talk a little bit about listening and I'll talk a little bit and then a little bit more about focus, because I see that focus is very important in this. Okay, Don?
Yeah, great.
Wonderful. So everybody, please stay tuned. You're listening to the Conscious Consultant Hour, Awakening Humanity, and we'll be right back after these messages.